Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk about what I view to be the proper view of gender, sex, all those concepts that are brought up quite a bit in the culture war. But so I find a lot of both sides to be fairly cringy. I don't think anybody does a good job of explaining their positions. And I think the anti-SJW movement is really cringy in the way that they conduct themselves and argue for ideas. They don't really seem to have an understanding of the science of the issue. And ultimately, I think this video where I discuss my view on what gender is and transgenderism and all that sort of stuff, I think it's going to push away a lot of people who don't like the liberal side of the culture war, because I think I actually have a fairly liberal opinion on this sort of thing. But I mean, let's just get into it. I think just pay attention, because this is something that I have actually changed a lot on very recently and had some new ideas about. I think I'm not gonna satisfy any side with this video. I don't think. So I'm just going to explain my view of gender. To begin, I'll set up some context. So at birth, everyone is given a sex based on their genitalia, and I agree with this. I think when you're born, you're male or female. That's the sex that you're given, and men have penises and women have vaginas. That is a fact, and that determines your sex. However, sex is more of a description, from my understanding, of the sex organs, while gender describes your personality traits and societal roles, how society views someone of your gender should act. So like women, there's more of a view that they're submissive and men is dominant, and just the general ideas that come with gender in modern society, and like the roles that each gender plays and all that sort of stuff. So, however, each person is born an individual. They're a blank slate with their own unique traits and personalities, as over time your subconscious becomes formed based on choices that you make and different premises that you begin to hold. So, often this means that people will have some traits that contradict the gender that corresponds to their sex. What I mean by gender that corresponds to your sex, I mean the gender that society, or how society expects someone of a certain gender to behave. That's what I'm referring to here, because society has certain expectations of traits that come with a gender. So often people will have traits that contradict the gender that corresponds to their sex. And I think everybody does, to an extent, have some traits that don't necessarily align with the societal gender that they were born with. But generally, I think most people tend to adhere a lot to what society views as their gender, because I think there's some extent that certain genetic predispositions play a role in this, based on just the idea that men and women are different. That's a fact. So certain genetic predispositions will lead you to behave more like the way society views your gender. However, this isn't always necessarily true. But the traits that define your gender, so I'm just going to keep going here with the train of thought that I was on earlier. The traits that define what your gender, as expressed by an individual, they can be referred to an individual's gender expression. The traits that you have related to gender stuff, related to the way that society views gender, that's the way that you express your gender. I'm going to call that gender expression. So the transgender issue basically begins when someone's gender expression contradicts the gender that corresponds with his or her sex. When it's basically saying that the traits that they have are different than what society expects of someone of their sex. So this often leads to people feeling bad in their gender, and it makes them feel like they don't belong as part of their gender. And since these traits are automatized by your subconscious, and your subconscious ultimately determines your identity. This would mean that your identity does not conform to the identity defined by the gender that corresponds to your sex. This is why trans people claim to identify as a separate gender. So this will lead them to want to change their gender, transition from their current gender to another, to relieve this like societal pressure that comes with all the expectations to express their gender in a way that someone of their gender or someone of the gender that corresponds to their sex would express their gender. If these differences in individual gender expression and the gender expression that is expected from someone of their sex are great enough, this person will feel like they need to switch, might feel like they need to switch their sex as well. But that transition I'm a lot more skeptical of, because it seems like they're making a change to reality, the reality they were born with, to fit this feeling they have, which I'm not a big fan of. It seems to me like primacy of consciousness. It's this idea that you're putting your feelings before what reality is. And I think that it's fair, like that surgery that they go through, it seems to be fairly damaging. It's to an extent like a way of, I don't know, that's really offensive if I say it, but it's almost a form of genital mutilation, because you're getting rid of the functions or the natural functioning of your genitals to replace them with a different type. And I think it's a very possibly damaging change, and it's much different from simply a label change that I am honestly completely okay with, labeling yourself as a different gender. But it's an actual metaphysical change of the body that's somewhat damaging. Yeah, so I think it's completely fine to switch the gender you identify as, since the traits you express might be different from the traits that you're expected to express based on your sex. However, I am not sure that switching your sex by changing your sex organs is necessarily a good idea. Now, let's expand this idea of these ideas that I'm talking about with gender. I'm going to go a little more in depth on them. So, since there's a large amount of traits that define what gender you are, you might possess a few from from one category and a few from another category. So the amount of traits that one possesses from each category ultimately falls on a spectrum that ranges from entirely masculine to entirely feminine. You might have certain traits that make you really masculine and other traits that are really feminine that you have, and ultimately this is like the number of masculine traits and the number of feminine traits that each person can fall on a spectrum of saying, okay, let's say there's a total of 7 possible traits. 7 masculine traits is here, all the way male. 6 masculine and 1 feminine is here, and then all the way down to 7 feminine. So ultimately, that is why I think the claim that saying gender is a spectrum is actually a valid claim in this sense, since these traits that define gender expression fall on a spectrum ranging from entirely male to entirely female. So I think ultimately it does make sense in this context to say that gender is a spectrum, because you have a certain amount of traits from each socially defined category. So then if you have more masculine traits, you're obviously more masculine, but those few feminine traits also have an effect on what your overall gender is. So it almost shifts you towards a more feminine side on this hypothetical gender spectrum. So this is my general view on gender, and I think some people are gonna take this really strangely because it's not something that they think about very much, and they do have a lot of prior conceptions about what gender is, and this whole idea there's only 2 genders, which I think is definitely true. I think there's only 2 things that are defined by society as a gender, and there's only two sexes that correspond to certain gender traits or these are the traits that you see generally manifest in people with this sex. So I think there is technically only two genders. But I think that people can fall on a range between those two genders with the certain traits that they have. And I think that's ultimately what most people mean when they say gender is a spectrum. So I think a lot of the misunderstanding between two people, or between the people on the left and the right in regards to the gender issue, simply don't understand exactly what the other side is advocating. And there's a lot of miscommunication in that sense and misunderstanding based off of just simple differences in how they conceptualize gender. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say for today. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Peace.